So last week, Mexican ambassador to the U.S., Esteban Moctezuma, visited Arizona to participate in the 10th annual Arizona CEO Summit. How does the visit reflect Mexico's evolving approach to regional collaboration and what emerging trends are shaping the Mexico-Arizona relationship? When we hear the sort of big crazy ideas about fentanyl and border crossing, do you have a sense of what are people feeling as they watch the leaders of the US and Mexico and Canada, what's happening with the USMCA? But how do people in Mexico feel right now?
So I think on the side, the companies are calm and the companies are ready to go into the review. But of public officials currently doesn't know what kind of degree of review is going to be. This really intertwined between the economies of the US and China. I think now on that conversation is TikTok. What are the implications of this so-called TikTok trade deal?
So there's this little organization called the G7. They're all the nations that think they're guiding the world. And so China is the number 2 economy in the world. Why shouldn't the number 2 economy in the world be a part of this group of nations that are guiding the global political economy? But it's okay. You guys can be at the kids' table. It's very offensive to the Chinese people I talk to that. Hello, everybody. So good to see you all. We're all just so interested and concerned with the state of global trade and what's going on with a lot of important economies in the world. As you all know, on Global Leadership, we talk a lot about U.S.-China trade relations. We talk about leadership on the one side, but also U.S.-China trade relations, and we go deep on the China questions. It's been a really crazy time, and in my trips to China over the last year, the tension has been so brewing. But at OGL, we like to go deep. We like to go deep on different issues that have to do with leadership or global trade. And one of the things about going deep is picking different case studies. So one of the things that's really interesting in U.S.-China trade relations right now is for many years, the United States and China have been the top 2 trade partners. And then suddenly, China wasn't the U.S. number 1 trade partner anymore. Mexico was. And so it's a really interesting thing to ask the question of how could a little country like Mexico suddenly become China's or the United States' number 1 trade investor? Well, the Chinese government is very thoughtful. And I know the economists that advise the senior people in the Chinese government. They're very thoughtful about saying okay, if there are going to be trade barriers, if there are going to be tariffs, maybe we'll send things to Mexico and then have things come over the border from Mexico to China. And suddenly Mexico rises to be China, the United States' number 1 trading partner. Fascinating stuff, right? And so what we want to do on Global Leadership is help people understand the dynamics of this. And so I have the gift today of being here with Andrés. First, we're going to talk about, U.S.-China trade and through Mexico, et cetera. And then we're going to be talking about Mexico and the United States. So Andrés, over to you. Please introduce yourself and let us know who you are. And we're excited about the brilliance you bring to the table.
No, thank you, Professor Guthrie. It's a pleasure to be here at OGL. As you say, there's really interesting topics happening right now with the start of a new U.S. administration, also in Mexico, a new administration. So we have seen many changes on international trade. But as you say, not only on trade, we have seen an intertwined with politics, geopolitics, security, migration. So we have seen a different mix of issues, really important that we need to analyze. And it's a pleasure to be here at the podcast and to give you a Mexican perspective of things. How do we see it in Mexico? But also ask you questions about how is the Chinese situation for both of our audiences. I'm Andrés. Currently, I work at Camargo International Consulting. It's a new consultancy in Mexico that wants to put tech first in order to analyze the different developments. As we have been talking, there's a lot of news, a lot of analysis. So sometimes it's hard to keep up with everything that's happening on the news. So how can tech solve that difficult question in how to analyze and advise on different governments and companies? So that's all. Previously, I have worked at the British Embassy in Mexico, also at the U.S. Consulate in Southeast Mexico, and the CDE. So I have seen like both in the consultancy firm, but also how the foreign governments see and analyze this kind of topics. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think would be really, really great.
Why don't we start off with the questions for Mexico? Here's my first question. So, with Mexico having opened public consultations last week in the 2025 USMCA review, how's the country positioning itself for renegotiations with the US and Canada? And how might current tariffs and bilateral discussions and regional security concerns influence the next phase of North American trade cooperation? And here again, as you know, so that's my basic question, but I'm very concerned with this US-China relations stuff and like with our sort of thinking about the collaborative relations across, North America and Mexico and Central America and South America. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, as you say, is I think the hot topic now in Mexico-US relations, that this USMCA review in 2026. It's really important because as we talked previously, we only have trade on the equation, no? But now with China, now with the geopolitics of the world, we are seeing in the USMCA that mostly on the start, it was just trade. Now it needs to have in consideration migration, security, no? So we have more geopolitics inside, and that is what we're going to see in the USMCA review. Despite the USMCA just focusing on trade, this is not a general agreement that has trade, security, and migration in hand. It's definitely not. It's just trade. But we are seeing this kind of accountability. Okay, we're going to advance trade if we advance migration and security, even though it's not specifically in the treaty. So that is the trend that we are seeing right now. Most importantly, it's difficult to assess what we see in the media and the analysis that we do, because it is a review and not a renegotiation. That is important. Despite US President Donald Trump saying it's a renegotiation on the media, it's a mandatory review. So they previously renegotiated this USMCA because previously it was a different treaty. They kind of upgraded this treaty, and now we're doing like a review. It's a mandatory review. So we kind of expect it. It's not something out of the blue. It's planned that it's going to happen, this review. But now we're seeing that this review is going to be like more intense because different topics are going to brought in the conversation, mostly on tariffs, because we have seen the news, different tariffs, not only on Mexico, but in all countries in the world. But with Mexico is like a specific case study because we have the USMCA. So now what the US wants is to put all trade under USMCA provisions. Why? Because the USMCA has different rules, agreements, provisions that mandates that different and specific products are assembled within a specific, like production within those three countries, Mexico, US, and Canada. But some part of the trade between these three countries is made outside of the USMCA. So mostly now, like the trend in this review is to all the trade falls under USMCA provisions. And if it falls under USMCA provisions, it's exempted on different tariffs that now the Trump administration has put on Mexico. So I think that's the main trends, Professor Guthrie, on this review.
And can I just dig a little deeper? I mean, thank you for that summary. I think that's amazing. And it's so important. Again, we're in this really critical time of US-China relations, US dominance in global trade, US-Mexico relations, and so, yes, I love your summary of like what's happening with the USMCA, but how do people in Mexico feel right now in terms of how, and this is one of our things at OGL, we like to dig deeper than just like, what are the policy issues and what are the policy data, but like, how are people feeling? Do you have a sense of like, how are people feeling?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's a question that depends on the people you're speaking to. I think in a general sense, we could not say like worries. There's not like a general worrisome for the review, but there's kind of expectation into see what is going to be, if it's actually going to be a review or it's going to be a renegotiation. So Mexico currently doesn't know what kind of degree of review is going to be, if they're going to speak like different topics, if they're going to bring new topics into the conversation. For example, if they want to bring semiconductors into the trade, if they're going to bring tech. So we have this kind of expectation, but also there's been currently good conversations between both governments. So I think on the side, the companies are calm and the companies are ready to go into the review. As you said, last week, it was the official launch of the public consultations. So the main objective of these consultations is to assess what are the main worries, both of citizens, but of companies, but of public officials, in order to calm this sense of, we don't know what we're going to discuss in this review. So I think in general, Mexico is preparing for the review, but not knowing if it's going to be like a really in-depth review or not.
Well, and so thank you for that, Andres, because like I love that, like when we hear the sort of, big crazy ideas about like fentanyl and like, border crossing, and this is not the big issues are the things that you talked about, which are like, the flow of technology and the flow of labor for technological development. I mean, I live in both the states of Michigan and Phoenix and Arizona, but Arizona, is getting $160 billion invested from TSMC to build, the TSMC semiconductor fabs, and we're going to need labor, right? And so, like, my guess is that, there have to be conversations about border crossings that are not building the wall, but are instead about collaboration and coordination. And so I'm glad that you think those conversations are actually happening. That's really important. So I have another question for you. So last week, Mexican ambassador to the U.S., Esteban Moctezuma, visited Arizona to participate in the 10th annual Arizona CEO Summit. So how does the visit reflect Mexico's evolving approach to regional collaboration, and what emerging trends are shaping the Mexico-Arizona relationship?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because previously we have seen just only like the main conversation happens between federal governments, like the federal government of Mexico talking with the federal government of the US. But now we're seeing a trend with more communication between the federal government of Mexico and a specific cities, a specific, like trade clusters in the US. And this trend happened interestingly because of migration, because of the migration trends and the migration pressures that the U.S. administration has put in Mexico. Evidently, Mexico has need to step up in their consular efforts. And these consular efforts means they need to speak with the specific consuls in the specific cities where they have like many Mexican nationals there. And because they are there, they say, well, we've better take advantage of being there and talk about trade. So that's really interesting now that Mexico has different conversations with different cities, and we need to understand the visit of the Mexican ambassador to Arizona in that sense, that now we are having conversations with the specific cities. The second trend is that also the Mexican government has a strategy to bolster the USMCA, and to have not only the federal US government on board, but also US companies on board. And the US companies, like speaking good terms to the federal government of the USMCA. So the Mexico strategy is to show the US companies that they have really good benefits doing trade under USMCA. So for example, if Arizona companies are listening, is okay, you can go to the Mexican government. They can explain you the benefits of doing trade under the USMCA, because if you do it in this way, you're not going to have the tariffs that the Trump administration has put. So that's the main thing and the main trends. And the Mexican government interest is create the relationship with the cities to lobby for the USMCA and take advantage of this, consular network that they are building as well. Because Mexico has 50 consulates in the US. So that's the strategy they are pursuing right now.
Brilliant. I love that. And again, it's sort of fun for me to be in this place called Arizona because, 50 years ago, Arizona was just a desert town and Phoenix was, a city, but it wasn't. But now it's one of the fastest growing economies in the United States and one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. And that is only, I mean, that's partially helped by things like TSMC's $160 billion investment in the state, but it's also just through the collaborative relationships with our neighbor, Mexico. And so I think it's a really interesting moment, Andres. And so I'm so thankful for you helping our listeners understand this better. I think it's an amazing time.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing time for companies in Arizona. I think mainly because they could assess with the USMCA review what are the hot topics right now. What are the hot topics to do trade, for example? So we have a really strong steel industry. Like Mexico has this plan that it's called Plan Mexico. And within Plan Mexico, they try to boost domestic production, but also to attract foreign investment. So Mexico wants to step its efforts on technology, for example, because as you say, I think technology has been not the main topic in the bilateral relationships, but now we are seeing a change in that tech is going to be. It happened this week that Mexico became now the main exporter of technology to the US. So we're seeing this change, and now companies need to say, well, if we trade under the USMCA, we're going to have big advantages. We're going to do like lots of business. And I think that's what the Mexican government wants to promote, no?
And this thing that you just mentioned is so important because again, it relates to the sort of different flows of global trade because we've always thought of Mexico as like, well, it's exporting labor and exporting cheap industry goods. But then as Mexico kind of grows in its relationship with countries like China and is becoming, the locator for a lot of export of Chinese technical goods, and then Mexico's developing its own technological goods, and then I mean, it's Mexico's changing its position in the global political economy. I mean, it's a really interesting time right now. And so I'm so thankful to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's going to be quite tricky as well because one of the main topics in the USMCA is going to be traceability because of China, as you say. Because of the rules of the USMCA, Mexico needs to make sure that certain products have the specific percentage of manufacturing under the three countries, US, Canada, and Mexico. So now companies need to make sure they have those documentation in hand to prove that a specific products are actually made inside of those three countries and not like between a third country, so to speak, China, that is some of the worries of the US, is to make sure that the products are actually made in Mexico and in the US.
But one thing that's really important here, and we're going to talk about China in a second, but made in, you and I both know this because we study this stuff, but made in is often misconceived of as final assembly, right? And so like if Foxconn has a plant in Mexico or Texas and final assembly or in Chennai, India, people think like, oh, that iPhone was made in India. But actually, there are hundreds of suppliers from all around the world. And so what it means for final assembly says made in versus what the real complexity of industrial development is in the technological space. It's an interesting time, or in automobiles, right? It doesn't just have to be technological. And I mean, it's, all over. It's just these companies that are final assembly companies are drawing from many parts of the world. And so you and I need to help the world continue to understand like this is a complex geopolitical trade system. And so we just need to all understand it. So I love your analysis of this.
Yeah, it's quite tricky. It's quite tricky because, as you say, you have like these percentages, but companies sometimes don't know what kind of percentage is actually assembled where and in what kind of the process needs to be done in which country. So I think that's difficult. That's what we help our clients with at CIC to understand what kind of percentage they need to make in which country. But it's quite interesting, and it's changing every day.
It sounds like you guys are doing fascinating work.
Yeah, I think now we can flip the question to China. Really interesting stuff happening right now at China as well. I think it would be good for you to make an introduction also on your work and your experience in China throughout the years, both on your academic perspective, but also on your boots on the ground experience. Would be really interesting to hear.
Okay, so I'll just jump into that, and then you can jump into your questions. So I grew up as a China scholar. When I went to the University of Chicago in the 1980s, I thought I was just going to be an economics major and then go work for McKinsey and go get into politics. But then I took Chinese, and I fell in love with the language, the literature, the history, and that was the year of the Tiananmen movement. And so I just sort of became obsessed with China. And so I took a year off of school. I was going to go live in Beijing, but because of the June 4th massacre, I couldn't. And so I went to live in Taiwan, studied language, literature, history, came back and was just obsessed. But I realized that my real issue was Chinese economics. And so when I got my graduate degrees, I thought a lot about economic development in China, and I did a lot of research in that space. I lived in Shanghai in the 1990s to study those issues and wrote a dissertation and some books. And so that's just been my life. Then I've been a business school professor for many years, and I was a dean of a business school for a little while. And after I left that work, took some time away, and I was the head of Apple University in China from 2014 to 2019, which was a critical time for Apple because it was under the new regime of Xi Jinping. And so it was, just sort of a fascinating time to watch this, but also to be kind of boots on the ground. And you mentioned that term, boots on the ground. You probably heard me say that. It's great to study the economics and study the data that the State Statistical Bureau puts out. But at OGL, we fundamentally believe in the idea that you have to have people on the ground talking to people and learning and understanding what people are doing. And so at OGL, I live in the United States, travel to China as much as I can, but I also have a team in China. And that's our goal, is just to help people understand in a deep way what's happening with the Chinese economy, not just from the state level statistical bureau data, but through talking to people in different cities, different provinces. We're big advocates also of second and third tier city studies. Everybody knows Shanghai, Shenzhen, Tianjin, Beijing, but very few people know about things that are going on places like Zhenjiang or Shenyang. So we study those cities very deeply and try to help people understand what's going on in the depths of China. And so that's my goal, is just to help the world understand what's happening at a macro level with geopolitical trade, but also to give them a sense of like a real deep understanding of what's happening in China. And so that's me.
I think it's really interesting work. And as you say, this analysis is necessary to understand, like go in depth in the topics. I just recently read an OG article about two, I think, events that happened at the same time. Really interesting. Now in September, so China hosted this military parade right in Beijing. Less noticed though was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. And in this summit, in the end, Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited China after a 7-year gap. So I think my question within this context is, Professor Guthrie, you as a China scholar, how do you see Chinese citizens reacting to these developments?
So a couple of key things. So first, it's really important. I love that you called this out, Andrés, because okay, so there's this big moment, right? And I don't know if everybody in the world knows this, but September was the 80th year anniversary of the end of World War II, right? And so part of the reason for this military parade was to sort of celebrate the fact that, China was under a horrible situation. I mean, we think about World War II as being about Nazi Germany and the situation in Europe, but China was also under horrible pressure and horrible situation with Japan. And so the United States, and my own school is named after the Thunderbird School of Global Management, is named after the air sites in Glendale, Arizona, that sort of help people fly over, and the Flying Tigers, help save China. And So it's an interesting celebratory moment of China's sort of liberation from what looked like a very dark time in World War II. And, so that's wonderful. Now, we then went through the period of Mao Zedong and then the economic reforms and Deng Xiaoping and, Jiang Zemin and Zhou Enlai. And then, and so then we had Xi Jinping come to power after Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. And it was a much more sort of hard-edged. I don't like to loosely use the term authoritarian, but it is like it's a very hardcore approach to things. And Xi Jinping wanted to rise to power and say like, no, okay, China is not just going to be the manufacturer for the West. We are going to come out and be a leader in the global political system. And Xi Jinping has been fighting for that for the last decade, right? So he came to power in 2013. We're now 12 years out in 2025. And he's been really focusing on the idea of like, China's not just the manufacturing for the world or the manufacturer for the West, but we are the leader of the global South, and we would like to be appreciated as the leader for a leader in the world. And so here's one thing that I always like to cite to people, Andreas, is, so there's this little organization called the G7, right? The group of 7 nations, and they're the United States and France and Britain and they're all the nations that think they're guiding the world. And then there's this little kids table called the G20, right? And so like they're all of the places that we're helping to develop, right? And so China is the number 2 economy in the world. And it's very offensive to the Chinese people I talk to that they're not a part of why isn't the G7 the G8? Like why shouldn't the number 2 economy in the world be a part of this group of nations that are guiding the global political economy? But it's okay. You guys can be at the kids' table. You're in the G20. It's great. And this is very offensive to a lot of Chinese people, but it's very offensive to leaders like Xi Jinping. And so China has been staking up a position of saying like, you know what? Okay, guys, if that's what you want to go do, you go do your thing. But we are going to continue to build what is going on in the global political economy. We're going to be the leaders of the global South, right? And so there's a term in Chinese called Nanan Hezuo, which means South-South relations or South-South cooperation. And leaders in China are just like, okay. Now, of course, they know that their number 2 or number 3 trading partner is still the United States. And so we can't just walk away. But they have much more power, Andreas, in the system than people in the United States think. Like if we think we can just tell them to do whatever they want, here's an interesting thing. Apple's production, Apple is the most profitable company in the world, or maybe number 2 most profitable company in the world. 90% of their production is in China. So yes, Foxconn has a plant in Chennai, which is final assembly. But the reason that they are the most profitable company in the world is because of what Tim Cook built in that manufacturing supply chain in China. And if China suddenly pulled the plug and said, you guys, you got to go somewhere else, it would be a disaster economically for Apple. The single largest exporter from China to the United States is Walmart. It's not a Chinese company, it's an American company. And if China decided to play tough and pull the plug, it would be a disaster for Walmart. So you can start to see like, and then there is a little company called Tesla and a guy named Elon Musk, who's very influential in the global political economy. Their largest gigafactory and the supply chain of that gigafactory is in Shanghai, And so like, if China wanted to play tough, they could. But the kind of key issue, I think, here is, who are we and how are we being treated? And so to get back to your question, sorry for the long-winded answer, but, the event last month was an amazing event because it wasn't just, Xi Jinping inviting Putin and Kim Jong-un. And, so we have like the authoritarian quote unquote communist governments that have military or have nuclear power. But Modi showed up. And that was a big freaking deal because now this wasn't just Xi Jinping and Putin and Kim Jong-un. This was also Modi. And Modi, Modi is the democratic country of now the most populous nation in the world. And if you put China and India together, that's about, you know, 2.8 billion. That's about a third of the world's population. And so, I just think like the West is not paying attention enough to what's actually going on, because I think Xi Jinping is really orchestrating a very fascinating situation here where there's very, very, very political things that are happening, like the march and the military parade, but there's also things happening in Shanghai that are very military or very, very business oriented. And so I just think it's a fascinating moment. So I love your question, and yeah, it's a big time.
Yeah, I think it's a big time, but as you wrote on the article, I think we need to be expectant of what's going to happen in that relation, because I understand that Modi did not just went to the summit, right, but not to the military parade. So I think that's really interesting also to see,
Yeah.
like China and India had like a tricky relationship, and now we're seeing, like, okay, because of the U.S. Tariffs, they are aligning. But if it's that really true, and if it's going to last, also.
Yeah, it's a big complex moment, and thank you. I'm so honored that you're reading OGL stuff, but like, yeah, we're trying to piece together like what's actually happening, but it's a really complicated time.
And as you say, like this really intertwined between between the economies of the U.S. And China. I think now on that conversation is TikTok, inevitably, like the big topic on the trade of both economies. And I think my question now it's going to be, what are the implications of this so-called TikTok trade deal? And it's been on the works for quite some time, right? Different changes, different postponements of the date. So what are the main implication of this trade deal for the US-China business?
Well, it's a great question, Andreas, and I'll just say, not to pat myself on the back, but just to give listeners a little bit of context. Um, so I know the TikTok deal very well, because years ago I advised Huawei when Huawei was being banned from the United States, and it got developed a very close relationship with them. And then more recently, I got involved with the TikTok discussion. I wrote one of the amicus Supreme Court briefs um, for their case. The lawyers didn't follow my advice as much as I wish they would have, but I know the case, and it's a really interesting time to be thinking about this, because first of all, and this is where, if we're going to be talking about like what do Chinese people actually think of this, um, there's a big difference between companies like Huawei and TikTok, because Huawei, is a private company, and it's not owned by the Chinese government. The Chinese government does have a seat on the board, and it is the case that the founder Ren Zhengfei was, a member of the military and a Communist Party member, and so you could sort of understand like the stance. Okay, so if Huawei has all of these switching technologies and they're collecting data, does that mean they're getting access to all kinds of American data? Okay, so we need to like move to ban them from the United States, but even more than that, we need to ban them from, having access to any semiconductor technology that is produced by any company in the United States. In my opinion, Andreas, that's a bad move, because if you want to be able to monitor what people are doing in the world, you should build partnerships with them. If you ban them from any association with anybody in the United States, they're going to do their own thing. And this is what has happened with Huawei. Huawei is developing its own semiconductor technology. And there was a wonderful moment. Well, I shouldn't say wonderful, but it was a funny moment when Gina Raimondo about a year ago went to China to have a visit and talk about, Chinese supply chain dumping, et cetera. And it was Huawei launched their new iPhone, which had its own semiconductor chip that weekend. And so, that wasn't random. Like Huawei was basically saying, we got you. Like you can exclude us from the United States, but we're fine. And now they're leading the world. They're equally competitive with Apple in terms of the most advanced semiconductor technology that's going into their phones, and they're doing well. I would rather, if we want to monitor what's going on with other companies, we should be thinking about partnership. That's my first thing. Second thing, to answer your question, TikTok. So the thing that with TikTok that's really disturbing is ByteDance was very careful because of what happened with Huawei. ByteDance made it very clear that TikTok will not be in China. It's not a Chinese company. It's actually a Cayman Islands company. Um, so we think of TikTok as, a Chinese company, but TikTok doesn't exist in China. Douyin is its twin or its sister, or brother or whatever you want to call it in China, but TikTok doesn't exist there. It's a Cayman Islands company. The management and leadership are all in Singapore. And then when it started to build its relationship with the United States, it has a management team that's based in LA. But what are you going to do? Like, it's not a Chinese company, right? And so, I mean, ByteDance is a Chinese company, and ultimately TikTok has a filter down. And there is one Chinese official who has a seat on the board of ByteDance. But, if you're going to be in a global capitalist system, this is the way the world works. And so the thing that frustrates me about TikTok is ByteDance was so careful as they went through this evolution to be divorced from China so that TikTok could be a global company and not be under the same scrutiny that Huawei was. But because ultimately ByteDance is founded by, a Chinese entrepreneur, and TikTok is owned by ByteDance, we went after them. And I just think it's economically irresponsible to not go deep into your due diligence because of what it means for global trade. And so when I wrote my amicus Supreme Court brief, I'm very much focused what the U.S. Congress focused on was freedom of information. And so it was all a Freedom of Information Act question. For me, the question was really about global trade. If we go down this road, when a company like ByteDance has been so careful to delink TikTok from the United States just because it has a Chinese founder and a Chinese senior operating company, they can't get away from the idea that you must be in league with the Chinese government and you're giving all your data to the Chinese government. I just think that's irresponsible. And so I would have been a huge advocate of that point of view. And now it's very interesting because we have a president in the United States who he's much more Machiavellian. He doesn't really think about these things deeply, but he also knows that TikTok has been a huge advantage for him because short video clips helped him get elected. And so now what's happening is we see the Trump administration trying to sort of claw back this idea of protecting TikTok. And maybe, I was not in the negotiations that he and his team were having in Beijing, but it may be the case that this is sort of a white flower and saying like, okay, the President Xi, we're going to let TikTok in the United States and I'll fight Congress on this. And President Trump knows it's good for him because short glib social media is really good for young people. And so I just think it's a messy thing because we have U.S. politics over here. But my key point, Andreas, is I think we've mistreated TikTok. I think it's a huge mistake because we haven't thought analytically about what ByteDance tried to do to protect this situation from the sort of links to the Chinese government. And so I'm embarrassed for the United States on this.
And I think you're showing like a trend in general that in previous years you see first trade and then geopolitics. Now we have switched that, like maybe the first priority is geopolitics, not necessarily doing the good business. Like we need to have in sort of the geopolitics in check before doing good business. And also for the optics, as you say, the political optics, but also like the geopolitical optics as well.
Brilliant. I love your analysis of that. Like, I think, and you said it so much more simply and succinctly than I did. But yeah, you're exactly right. Like we're in a different phase right now. And so I love your analysis of it. And I love this conversation with you. So I hope this is just the first of many.
No, yes, it's been really interesting. I really care about China. I think in Mexico we care about China. Now the state of the diplomatic relations between Mexico and China are really in an interesting moment because we're seeing the pressures of trade. But as you say, they're like different kind of atmosphere also in the diplomatic relations. So that doesn't mean Mexico is not doing any relations with China. They have like the trade aspect in some sense, but they also have like the politically, diplomatic, cultural aspects with the Chinese relations. So I think it would be really interesting to keep analyzing these Chinese issues between all of these countries, right?
Well, and thank you for this, Andreas. Like this has just been a remarkable conversation, and I think you're a brilliant man, and the work that CIC is doing sounds brilliant. And so, um, let's just keep talking, and let's have multiple conversations about these things. And please, so more till next time. We'll keep going.
Till next time.